Well, I'm extremely grateful, Bruce, for that very kind introduction. I have absolutely no memory of mentioning this job at SAIS, but I'm glad that I did something useful. Well, welcome, I should say, first of all, to those from my old college who are here, but I won't start telling everybody about St Anthony's College, since there are a lot of people here who are not from there and would be rather bored by that. But I can tell you the college is in good shape, an excellent warden, Margaret Macmillan, and people are pretty happy there in spite of the hard times for universities as well as for other institutions these days. So the title of my talk is The Fall of the Wall and the Fall of Communism, Why and Why 1989. Now, with the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall almost upon us, that's my natural starting point. But I'll not spend much time on the immediate event, dramatic though it was. The basic facts are by now well enough known. So my focus will be mainly on the longer-term process that brought this about. The breaching of the wall was just one of a number of unintended consequences in a long chain of events in the transition from communism. Under increasing pressure, as a result of what was taking place in the Soviet Union and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the East German leadership decided to relax somewhat the regulations for East German citizens travelling abroad. It was no part of their intention, however, to open the borders completely. Nevertheless, a careless answer by Politburo member Günter Schabowski gave the impression at a press conference that the wall was going to be opened. This news was broadcast back into East Germany by a respected West German television presenter who said that the gates in the wall were open. At that point, they were completely closed, but it's a good example of how perceptions, even misperceptions, can change reality, because tens of thousands of people turned up at the Berlin Wall under the impression that they were open. They weren't open. The party leadership couldn't be consulted because they were in a late-night Central Committee meeting and everybody was afraid to interrupt it. And so the person in charge of the guards at the wall had to take a decision himself. And there were so many people there, rather than trying to shoot them all, he decided to open the gates. The next morning, Gorbachev was told about this by the East German ambassador. The whole Soviet Politburo were asleep at the time. The wall was opened at 11:30 in the evening in Germany. It was 2 hours later in Moscow. But when the East German, rather nervous East German ambassador told Gorbachev what had happened, Gorbachev told him that the leadership had taken the correct decision and please convey that view to the leadership. Now, in fact, the leadership hadn't taken that decision at all, and they were a good deal more nervous and alarmed by what had happened than Gorbachev himself was. The fall of the wall, though, is not synonymous with the fall of communism. The dismantling of communist systems within East Central Europe, and indeed in the Soviet Union itself, was already well advanced by the time the wall was breached 20 years ago. So I'm going to spend the remainder of my time examining the reasons for the fall of communism in Europe rather than for the fall of the wall in Berlin specifically. The opening of the wall was a logical, albeit unintended, consequence of the train of events which preceded it. We need to remind ourselves, though, that communism as a political movement was remarkably successful at one time, so far as sheer numbers were concerned. In the 1980s, almost a third of the world's population were living under communist rule. At various times since the Second World War, Western leaders have thought that communists were winning the East-West competition. In the 1950s, there were worries that the Soviet growth rate was faster than the growth rate of market economies. When the Soviet Union put the first person in space, this sent alarm bells ringing in the United States and elsewhere. And the Vietnam War was fought on the grounds that if the whole of Vietnam went communist, the rest of Asia would quickly follow, the so-called domino effect. As it happened, the dominoes fell not in Asia in the 1970s, but in Eastern Europe in 1989. We shouldn't forget either that thanks largely to the huge population of China, more than a fifth of humanity still live under what may be regarded as communist rule. Up until 1989, there were 16 communist states, as I would define them. Oddly, there are 36 countries today which were at one time communist. Now, that contradiction is to be explained by the fact that the Soviet Union, one state, broke up and became 15 states, and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia also broke up. So there only were 16 communist states, but there are 36 countries that were communist. And today there are 5 communist countries: China, Vietnam, Laos, North Korea, and Cuba. But the first 3 of them have been developing market economies and substantial private sectors. They are essentially hybrid regimes, politically communist, economically not. China has even been described as an example of party-state capitalism. Ideologically, it's a world away from the China over which Mao Zedong ruled. When I was in Beijing earlier this year, a professor of economics told me how puzzled he'd been to read that in a BBC poll, Karl Marx had emerged as the greatest philosopher of all time. He seemed to be much reassured when I told him this wasn't a scientific poll based on a representative sample. It was the kind of poll where people had to phone in or email in, so you had to take the initiative to register your vote. And the Marxists were more motivated and rather better organized than the supporters of Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes or David Hume. So communism has partly fallen even in China, with its population of 1.3 billion, which is now the workshop of the world. It has fallen more completely in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union, so the question is why, and why 1989? Much journalistic coverage between now and the end of the year will understandably focus on the events that made for the most dramatic pictures: mass demonstrations in Central European cities, and above all, East and West Germans dancing on the wall on 9th and 10th of November. Yet I'll argue that the most important changes, the ones which made the transformation of Eastern Europe possible, took place elsewhere, specifically in Moscow. There's absolutely no mystery about Poland, Hungary, or what was then Czechoslovakia, becoming independent and non-communist in 1989, once the peoples of those countries realized that this was highly unlikely to lead to Soviet military intervention. The same is even truer of the breaching of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent unification of Germany in 1990. All these things would have happened not just years earlier, but decades earlier, but for the perfectly correct assumption in East Central Europe that behind their own local party bosses stood the might of the Soviet Union, a Soviet military superpower, ready to intervene with all means necessary to defend what the Soviet Union regarded as its legitimate gain from the Second World War and its victory in the ground war against Nazi Germany. The Soviet invasions of Hungary in 1956 and of Czechoslovakia in 1968 were stark reminders for East and Central Europeans of the strict limitations on their autonomy. Poland was the least disciplined barracks in the camp, but even in Poland, solidarity, after its dramatic rise in 1980-81, was stopped in its tracks by the imposition of martial law in December 1981. The Soviet leadership, as we now know from the transcripts of the Soviet Politburo at that time, seriously considered military intervention in Poland in August 1980, but then they decided that this would create more problems than it would resolve. I'm sure they were correct in that assumption. They were already bogged down in Afghanistan at the time, and that was doubtless also a factor. And so in the course of 1981, they put enormous pressure on the Polish authorities to institute their own crackdown, which they duly did at the end of that